You tell an agent something important. 10 minutes and 40 tool calls later, it acts like you never said it. That's not the agent being lazy, and it's not ignoring you. It doesn't remember anything in the way you mean that word. Every single time it responds, it is rereading the entire conversation from the very beginning. And there is a hard, physical limit on how much of that conversation it can hold in its head at once. Here's the part that trips people up. A model has no persistent state between messages. Nothing is quietly saved in the background. When you send a new message, the system doesn't whisper a reminder to the model. It resends the entire transcript from message 1 plus your new line as one single input, every turn. The model's entire sense of the conversation so far is rebuilt from scratch every single time out of whatever text got handed to it that turn. Anthropic's own documentation calls this the context window. All the text a language model can reference when generating a response, a working memory, not the vast pile of data the model was trained on. Every turn has two halves, an input phase, which is all previous history plus your new message, and an output phase, the reply, which then becomes part of the input for the next turn. And it's not just the words you typed. The system prompt, every tool result, every image, every document, even the tool definitions themselves, all count against that same limit. So does the model's own internal reasoning, if it's using extended thinking. That working memory has a hard ceiling, measured in tokens, and it's not the same number for every model. As of today, Anthropic's newer models, the current Claude Opus and Sonnet lines, plus Fable 5 and Mythos 5, carry up to a 1 million token context window. Some earlier models in active use are capped at 200,000. Neither number is infinite, and both numbers are exactly the kind of thing that changes every time a new model ships. The ceiling moves, but there is always a ceiling. Here's the twist that actually explains the forgetting feeling. Giving a model more room to work with doesn't automatically make it sharper. Anthropic has a name for the opposite effect: context rot. As token count grows, accuracy and recall measurably degrade. More context isn't automatically better context. Curating what's actually in the window turns out to matter just as much as how big the window is. There's a specific, well-documented shape to that decay, and it's not the model runs out of room. Independent research on long context recall, the lost in the middle effect, found that models are noticeably better at using information placed at the very start or the very end of a long context than information buried in the middle, and that this holds true even for models explicitly built to handle long inputs. That detail you mentioned 10 minutes ago didn't get erased. It's still technically in there. It's just buried in the middle of an enormous transcript the model is skimming, not carefully rereading, every single turn. Eventually, a long-running session outgrows even a huge window, and something has to give. The fix most of these systems reach for is compaction, an automatic process that summarizes the earlier parts of a conversation so it can keep going past what would otherwise be a hard stop. Anthropic offers this server-side for the API directly. Claude Code, Anthropic's own coding agent, does the same thing to itself mid-session. When a session gets close to its limit, it quietly summarizes its own older history to free up space, the same way you might jot down the gist of a meeting instead of keeping the full transcript. A summary, by definition, throws away detail. That's not a bug in the feature. That is the feature, and it's the actual mechanism behind the wait. Didn't I already tell you this moment? And if you just try to shove more in past the ceiling, the system doesn't gracefully improvise. If the input alone is already bigger than the model's window, the request gets flatly rejected before generation even starts. If the response itself runs into the ceiling mid-generation, it simply stops, mid-thought, and reports that it hit the wall. No quiet workaround, a hard, documented architectural edge. Don't confuse this with retrieval, the trick where an agent looks up facts it was never trained on. That's a totally different fix for a totally different problem. Fetching new outside information into a conversation. This is the opposite failure. The model already saw the thing you're asking about. It said so in this very conversation. It's not missing the fact. It's failing to keep track of its own transcript. The practical fix looks less like magic and more like plain housekeeping. Start a clean conversation when you're switching to genuinely unrelated work instead of dragging stale context forward into every new question. Tell the summarization step explicitly what's worth keeping. instead of trusting a generic compaction pass. And for anything that produces a wall of noisy output, logs, test runs, long research digressions, hand it to a separate subtask so only the useful summary comes back into the main conversation, not the raw flood. This isn't a quirk of one chat interface. Every agent that runs for a long stretch, a coding assistant grinding through a multi-hour session, a browser agent clicking through dozens of pages, the very production pipeline that built this episode is fighting the identical problem underneath. A finite working memory that has to be actively managed, not just filled up and hoped for the best. That management now has its own name, context engineering. So the next time an agent seems to forget something you said a few minutes ago, it's not being careless. Either that turn genuinely isn't in its window anymore, or it's still technically in there. Buried in the middle of a transcript the model is skimming, not memorizing. Give it only what it actually needs, when it needs it, and it stops looking forgetful. That's not a trick. As of right now, that's basically the whole game.